What if a single letter could unravel the life you thought you knew? In the golden hush of a Wyoming morning, one woman's quiet courage sparked a story no one could predict. The Wyoming prairie stretched endless under a pale dawn, the tall grass swaying like a whispered promise. It was 1896, and Eleanor Whitmore stood atop a rise in Willow Creek, her emerald shawl catching the breeze. At 68, she was a widow, her elegance as unyielding as the land she ruled. Her late husband, Edward, had carved a cattle empire from the wild, but it was Eleanor who held it together through floods, debts, and the sting of betrayal, with a gaze that never wavered. Her grand house loomed behind her, its polished wood and tall windows gleaming in the light. But inside, it was a hollow kingdom. The hallways echoed with her solitary footsteps. The piano sat silent, and letters from her daughter, Alice, had long ceased. Each morning, Eleanor sipped tea on the porch, staring at the horizon as if it held answers. Each night, she read by candlelight, convincing herself the quiet was her choice. But was it truly madness? As the sun sank lower beyond the wide, endless plains, the sky above Willow Creek caught fire with hues of gold, crimson, and deep violet. The earth itself seemed to exhale, sighing into the coming night. In a modest room tucked at the back of a quiet general store, Eleanor sat at her oak desk, a desk battered and worn, each scratch and dent a memory of years spent chasing survival rather than dreams. Her fingers, calloused yet graceful, hovered over the fine stationery she had been saving for something special, though until now, she had never been quite sure what that something might be. Tonight, she dared to believe it was this. Not an order for supplies, not a business transaction, but a message of yearning, of fragile hope. Her hand trembled slightly as she picked up her pen, dipped it carefully in ink, and set it against the paper. She hesitated, the weight of loneliness pressing against her chest. But then the words began to flow, halting at first, then steadier, as if some hidden current was guiding her. To any gentleman of integrity, age 50 or above, she wrote, the scratch of the pen loud in the stillness. I seek not a worker, but a companion, someone to share quiet talks when the wind sings low across the plains, someone to sit beside me as the long nights settle in, when the world feels both too vast and too silent. She paused, swallowing hard against the sudden lump rising in her throat. She signed it simply, E. Whitmore, Willow Creek. There was no need for grand declarations or flowery endings. Just the bare truth of who she was, a woman who had lived too long in silence, daring to reach for a different kind of life. Sealing the letter carefully, she stared at it for a long moment, feeling as though she were binding a piece of herself within that thin paper and wax. Was she foolish to send it? To believe that across miles of dusty roads and unknown towns, someone might be waiting for a woman like her? As the stars pricked the darkening sky and the cool night winds curled around the edges of the store, Eleanor walked outside and lifted her face to the heavens. The letter, tucked safely in her apron pocket, felt heavier than gold. Tomorrow, she would ride into town and place it in the post, sending her hopes out into a world that had taught her so often to expect nothing. But tonight, under a sky so vast and alive it made her chest ache, Eleanor allowed herself one impossible thought. Maybe, just maybe, the right stranger was already out there, waiting like she was for a new beginning neither of them had dared to imagine. 1,000 miles away, where the cobblestone streets of Boston's Beacon Hill basked in a soft, golden morning light, William Prescott stirred his coffee with a slow, absent hand. The rising steam curled like ghostly ribbons in the chilly air, catching the glow of the sun filtering through lace curtains. At 70, William lived a life stitched together by quiet rituals, long, measured walks through the fog-draped streets, whispered verses of poetry offered to the empty air, and careful, tending to a small window garden overflowing with rosemary and thyme. He had been widowed for 10 years now, and though the sharp sting of grief had softened, the gentle weight of his wife's absence never truly left him. Her laughter, once bright and constant, still echoed faintly in the corners of their once shared home, a sweet ache he carried like a worn locket close to his heart. Over the years, he had stopped looking for surprises, teaching himself to find contentment in simple things. The crispness of an autumn morning, the scent of fresh herbs, the familiar creak of the wooden floor beneath his boots. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. As he sat in his study, thumbing idly through the morning newspaper, his eyes skimmed past the usual mundane notices, shipping schedules, market prices, town gossip, until something unexpected caught him off guard. Nestled in the back pages like a forgotten treasure was an advertisement, a few simple lines that stood out like a lone star in a moonless sky. A voice to share the silence. He read the words aloud, his voice low and rough with emotion, then read them again, slower this time, letting the meaning seep in. A woman, not begging for rescue, not cloaked in desperation, but standing tall despite life's storms, daring to ask for something more. She's not pleading for rescue, William said into the quiet, a soft chuckle escaping him. She's weathered her own storms and still stands. Before he could second-guess the impulse, William reached for a sheet of heavy stationery. His pen hovered for a long moment, ink trembling at its tip before he set it to paper. "My name is William Prescott," he wrote, the words steady and simple. "I am a man of modest means, offering steady company, a listening ear, and a kindness that lingers even after the coffee grows cold." He paused, staring at the words. Was this foolish? A man of his age, answering the call of a stranger across the miles? Doubt pricked at the edges of his mind. Yet beneath it, something stronger stirred. A flicker of excitement he hadn't felt in years, a small but persistent ember refusing to die. Sealing the letter with careful hands, William slipped it into the inner pocket of his worn coat. The air outside was crisp with morning mist as he made his way toward the post office. With a final glance at the gray sky above, he tipped his hat respectfully to the unseen hand of fate and murmured under his breath, almost smiling, "Let's see where this leads." 2 weeks later, beneath a restless Wyoming sky where the clouds moved like ghost ships across the blue, Eleanor stood on the creaking porch of her small home. The wind tugged impatiently at her scarf, wrapping it around her throat like a protective arm. Dust swirled around her boots as the post boy approached, a thin figure against the wide, aching landscape. In his hand, he held a single envelope, its edges softened and worn by the miles it had traveled, the ink slightly smudged from handling, yet still sturdy in its purpose. Eleanor's heart knocked once hard against her ribs. She took the letter with hands that looked steadier than they felt, offering the boy a silent nod of thanks before turning back into the house. Inside, the room smelled faintly of coffee and wood smoke, grounding her as she sat at her oak desk, the old companion of her solitude. For a long moment, she simply ran her fingertips over the envelope, tracing the careful, deliberate script that spelled her name. It felt strange and sacred, holding this small, hopeful thing in her hand. Finally, she broke the seal and unfolded the paper, her breath catching as William's words unfurled before her eyes. Warm, measured, and profoundly sincere. "I offer no grand vows," he had written, "only the steadiness of a man who values quiet moments and honest talk." She read the letter once, then a second time, and again a third, as if afraid the words might change or vanish if she blinked. Slowly, a rare smile, tender and almost disbelieving, curved her lips. "He's real," she whispered to the empty room, feeling the truth of it settle into her bones, steady and sure. And no fool. The next morning, sunlight poured through the window in soft, golden beams, bathing the desk in light as Eleanor sat down to reply. Her pen hovered for a moment, the vastness of possibility stretching before her. Then she wrote with quiet conviction, "Your sincerity touched me. I've lived in quiet longer than I ever meant to. I like to write again." She sealed the letter with a small but certain flutter of her heart and sent it on its way, a thread cast into the unknown. And so began a delicate dance of words across the great, empty plains, a slow weaving of hopes and hidden corners of themselves into something tangible. William wrote of his love for the poetry of Emerson, how he recited verses aloud during his evening walks, letting the rhythm of the words echo down the misty streets. He told her about the small garden he tended with near-reverent care, and how he often found himself humming old folk tunes as he watered the herbs. Eleanor, in turn, revealed dreams she had long buried. How she once imagined herself swirling through grand ballrooms in Paris, the silk of her gown brushing marble floors. How she had an odd gift for sensing the rain long before the first drops kissed the earth. She spoke of the way the prairie sang in certain winds, and how loneliness could make a woman both fierce and fragile. Their words were not fiery with wild passion, nor desperate with longing. Instead, they were tender, careful, like a fire kindled slowly and lovingly at dusk, each letter adding another piece of dry wood, another spark, another quiet, growing flame. Yet as the weeks passed and their letters grew longer, deeper, richer with detail, a question began to form like a shadow at the edges of Eleanor's heart. Could this connection, built only with ink, paper, and imagination, truly survive the heavy weight of reality? Sometimes, she found herself pausing longer before sealing each reply, her pen poised above the page as doubt whispered against the growing warmth. What happens when words must become voices? When imagined faces must become real ones? When the safety of distance must give way to the vulnerability of presence? Still, each time, she chose to send her letter anyway, daring to believe that maybe, just maybe, this fragile thing they were building could be strong enough to endure. Winter had begun to loosen its grip on Boston, the snow retreating into patches of tired slush, when William stood at South Station with a small, battered bag resting by his feet. Inside it were only the essentials, two neatly folded shirts, a well-worn book of poetry, and a bundle of Eleanor's letters, tied together with rough twine as if they were precious artifacts from another life. Before he left, he had placed a simple note on the polished wood of his writing desk. "Gone west to meet the woman whose words woke my heart." His coat was buttoned high against the lingering chill, his breath a ghost in the morning air. Yet if there was fear in him, it did not touch the firm set of his shoulders. He was a man who had learned that some chances are too rare to ignore, and some voices too important to leave unanswered. The train clattered out of the city with a steady rhythm, each mile unspooling the familiar world behind him. It roared through crowded towns, whispered through dense forests, and finally stretched into the endless plains, where the sky widened into forever and the land seemed to breathe. At night, in the narrow berth of his cabin, William would light the small lantern fixed to the wall and pull out her letters. He read them slowly, reverently, as if they were prayers, sometimes murmuring the words aloud into the hush of the moving train. One line lived inside him now like a secret flame. "I miss the clink of another cup beside mine, the warmth of someone who listens to know me." Those words had become his compass, steady and unwavering, pulling him toward a woman he knew only through the fierce honesty of her heart. Hundreds of miles away, in the quiet town of Willow Creek, Eleanor stood in her front room, the telegram still trembling in her hands. Arriving Wednesday. WP. 4 days after its arrival, she moved through her home with a brisk efficiency, scrubbing floors, airing out the small guest room, smoothing fresh linens until they were crisp and perfect beneath her hands. She tucked a few sprigs of dried lavender into a vase on the nightstand, its fragrance whispering calm into the room. To any neighbor peering in, she would have seemed the very picture of composure, practical, prepared, unshakable. But inside, beneath each practiced movement, her heart raced like a runaway horse. 1,000 doubts whispered against her ribs. What if he wasn't the man she had imagined? What if the poetry of their letters collapsed under the weight of real voices, real glances, real hesitations? The day arrived on a breath of cold wind and brittle sunlight. Eleanor stood on the edge of the station platform, her scarf whipping around her, her gloves clenched tight. The distant whistle of the approaching train pierced the sky, a lonely sound that seemed to stretch and tremble across the plains. As the engine thundered into view, dust spiraled up in little eddies around her boots, and the train screeched to a halt with a metallic sigh. Passengers stepped down one by one, blinking against the prairie sun, clutching their hats and small bags. She scanned the faces, tired travelers, businessmen, ranch hands, and then she saw him. Tall, a little stooped from the weight of years, but upright still, his hair brushed with gray, his city coat too thin for the biting Wyoming wind. He clutched a simple leather bag and looked around, his eyes moving quickly, almost anxiously, searching, and then his gaze found hers. No words passed between them, not yet. No polite smiles or hasty greetings. Just a long, charged moment of recognition, as if two souls standing across a narrow, fragile bridge, built out of paper, ink, and countless nights of hope, finally saw one another. They had written their way to this moment. Every letter, every quiet confession, every dreamed what if had led them here. Now, the real question hung in air like the last note of song. Could they step into it? Could what was built across distance survive in the space where distance no longer existed? The prairie wind whistled past them, carrying away the dust and fear, leaving only possibility behind. Eleanor and William wandered the narrow garden paths behind her house, where winter's breath still clung to the earth. Frost silvered the sleeping rose bushes, their brittle stems clicking faintly in the morning breeze. Their footsteps fell into an easy rhythm, crunching softly over the gravel, and their silences held a weight as meaningful as any conversation. Eleanor spoke of the land. How, come spring, the hills would erupt in wild lupins, and the air would shimmer with the hum of bees. She told him how she could smell rain hours before it fell, how the first whippoorwill's call in April meant the hard frosts were done for good. William, in turn, shared glimpses of his own world. The chaotic song of Boston's bustling docks, the sight of sails crowding the harbor like white birds, and the evenings he spent reading Emerson's poetry aloud to the restless waves. They did not reach for each other, did not hurry the space between them with hasty touches. Instead, their ease became its own quiet promise, something tender and growing, as cautious as the first crocus pushing through snow. But Willow Creek was a place where news traveled faster than the river current after a thaw. Whispers seeded themselves in the town before the train's dust had even settled. At the general store, at the churchyard gates, at the feed mill, people leaned in and murmured, "She's brought a man from Boston." No less, they said. An office manager, living under her roof? Mark my words, he's after her land. Her money. The gossip, sharp-edged and careless, found its way to Eleanor's ears, each word pricking her like unseen thorns. And though William never spoke of it, he heard them too, carried their judgment on his back like an old, familiar weight. One morning, as they worked side by side, pruning the brittle rose canes, William spoke without lifting his eyes from his careful work. His voice was steady, as if reciting something he had long ago made peace with. "When I was a boy," he said, snipping a dead branch, "others mocked the way I limped after falling from a tree. Mocked my worn coat, my hand-me-down shoes. They thought weakness lived in the surface of a man. He paused, his hands deft and patient. They stopped when they realized I wouldn't run. Eleanor stood still, the shears limp in her hand. Her gaze softened, the hard knot in her chest loosening slightly. Yet later, in the stillness of her study, doubt crept into the quiet places of her mind. She sat at her desk, staring at the worn papers before her, her will still naming her niece Alice as sole heir. Eleanor's fingers hovered over the parchment, the ink smudged slightly by the moisture in the air. A question gnawed at her. Should she change it? Leave William something? Even something small? A patch of land? A gesture that said, "You mattered"? Or would it taint everything? Would it make him think she believed loyalty could be bought? The tension weighed on her, thick as the heavy clouds gathering on the horizon. One gray afternoon, with the fire crackling low and a pot of tea cooling between them, Eleanor set her teacup down with a soft clink and met his gaze across the worn table. "The town," she said, her voice low but steady, "thinks I'm a fool. That you're after what little I have." William didn't flinch. He didn't bristle or offer a rehearsed defense. He simply looked at her, calm, weathered, true. "I didn't come for your land," he said quietly, "or your money. I came because, for the first time in a long while, your words made me feel like I wasn't speaking into an empty room. You were brave enough to send that letter. I was just brave enough to answer it." Eleanor's heart, tight and anxious for days, softened like snow melting under sunlight. His honesty warmed the chilled corners of her spirit. Still, outside the safety of her home, the whispers curled through the streets of Willow Creek, stubborn as burrs. The garden they were tending, this delicate, fragile trust, was taking root. But even strong roots could be tested by coming storms. And somewhere deep inside, Eleanor knew the true trial was not behind them, but waiting just ahead. Rain pounded the ranch one night, and the next morning, carriage wheels sloshed through the mud. Alice, Eleanor's daughter, stepped onto the land, her traveling cloak damp but her posture rigid. Her eyes were sharp, like a hawk sizing up prey. "I heard," she said, her voice cool as she faced her mother on the porch. Inside, over porcelain teacups, Alice pressed. "A man from a newspaper? Living here? Have you rewritten your will?" "No changes," Eleanor said, her tone even. "William is a friend." Alice leaned forward. "You're wealthy, mother. Alone. Men have married for less." Eleanor's voice was calm but firm. "He's asked for nothing. Not land, not money, just a chair beside mine." That afternoon, Alice found William in the barn, mending a fence with steady hands. "What do you want from my mother?" she demanded, her voice low. "Her company," he said, meeting her gaze. "She's strong. That's why I'm here." Alice blinked, caught off guard by his simplicity. That night, as thunder rumbled, Eleanor sat at her desk, staring at the unsigned draft of her new will. She wasn't afraid, but she wasn't ready to sign. Downstairs, William stood by the back door, watching lightning streak the sky, reciting a quiet poem to himself. She joined him, the wind rattling the windows. "Do you ever think we've made a mistake?" she asked softly. "No," he said. "Even if this ends tomorrow, I'll never regret answering your letter." She leaned into him, her shoulder brushing his. It wasn't surrender, it was trust. The storm passed, but a new challenge waited. The next morning dawned pale and cold, a thin mist clinging to the fields like a breath the earth hadn't yet exhaled. In the kitchen, Alice stood by the window, clutching something in her hand. When William entered, she turned, her face carefully blank, giving nothing away. In silence, she extended the worn document toward him. The unsigned will, the paper slightly creased where she had gripped it too tightly. "She's thinking about it," Alice said at last, her voice neutral, but edged with something he couldn't quite name. William unfolded the pages slowly, his eyes skimming over the lines until he found it. A small plot of land, not grand or imposing, but significant. It bore his name, written in Eleanor's careful, deliberate script. It wasn't wealth. It was something gentler, a quiet acknowledgement, a hand extended not in pity, but in trust. His fingers tightened slightly on the parchment. "I didn't ask for this," he said, his voice steady but low, carrying more weight than the words themselves. "I know," Alice replied, studying him with an intensity that made the room feel smaller. "But others might assume you did. Around here, they always assume the worst first." For a moment, they simply looked at each other, two strangers caught in the delicate web of another's choices. Then Alice spoke again, her tone shifting, softer but no less direct. "Do you love her?" she asked, and in her voice was the hard, aching hope of someone who had seen too many people offer affection with strings hidden underneath. William did not falter. His answer came without hesitation, rooted deep in his bones. "I do," he said, "not for her strength or for what she owns. I love her for her quiet moments, for the rare laughter she tries to hide, for the way her eyes soften when she speaks of a past that still lives inside her. I love her because she never asked for the world, only for someone to see her." Alice's shoulders, tight and defensive, eased just a fraction. Something unspoken passed between them. Not approval, perhaps, but a kind of truce. She turned away toward the window again, pretending to watch the wind stir the empty yard. But something in her had shifted, like a locked door nudged just slightly ajar. That evening, the sun sank low, bleeding streaks of gold and crimson across the vast Wyoming sky. Eleanor found William in the cottonwood grove behind the house, where the tall grass whispered secrets to the wind. He stood alone, the soft rustle of the trees around him, holding a letter, the letter she had written him weeks ago, when uncertainty was all they had. Her words were worn at the folds, but still clear. "You owe me nothing, only the kindness you've already shown." For a long moment, neither spoke. The world around them held its breath, caught between day and night. "What did you decide?" Eleanor asked at last, her voice barely more than a breath. The question trembled in the air between them, fragile and immense. William turned to her, folding the letter carefully, almost reverently. He took her hand in his, warm, calloused, real. His thumb brushed lightly over her knuckles, grounding them both. "I'll stay," he said simply. "Not for land, not for legacy, but for you. Because with you, Eleanor, I'm not just passing time. I'm living." The words, honest and unadorned, melted the last defenses she had carried like armor for so long. She stepped closer, the earth shifting softly beneath her boots, her heart racing loud enough that she was sure he must hear it. Then, under the dimming sky, with the cottonwoods swaying gently above them, Eleanor rose on her toes and kissed him, a kiss that was not desperate or hurried, but steady and sure, a promise given in silence. In that moment, the future was not something to fear. It was something they could build together. Days turned to weeks, and Eleanor and William settled into a rhythm. They shared mornings in the garden, evenings with books, their conversations weaving a tapestry of trust. William would sometimes recite poetry under the stars, his voice soft but steady, and Eleanor would listen, her heart stirring. But the town's whispers grew louder. "She's too old for such nonsense," some said. "He's after her fortune," others hissed. One afternoon, as they walked the creek's edge, Eleanor stopped. "Do you hear them, William? They think we're fools." He smiled faintly. "Let them talk. They don't know the woman who wrote that ad, or the man who couldn't resist answering." Her laughter was brief, but real, a sound she hadn't heard in herself for years. Yet at night, alone, she wrestled with her will. Leaving William something felt right, but what if it fueled the gossip? What if Alice saw it as weakness? The next morning, Alice lingered after breakfast. "I spoke to him," she said. "He's different than I expected." Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "And I don't trust easily," Alice said. "But I'm starting to." It wasn't approval, but it was a crack in the wall. Eleanor felt lighter, but the question remained. Could their story outlast the doubts? Spring arrived, and beneath the cottonwood trees, Eleanor and William stood together. She wore a sapphire gown, its hem brushing the grass. He wore a neat coat, his shoes polished despite the dust. No rings, no fanfare, just their hands entwined, steady as the land around them. The townsfolk gathered, some curious, others warm. Alice stood nearby, her children tugging at her skirt, their laughter bright. A pastor spoke softly. "Do you come together in wisdom, in partnership?" Eleanor spoke first, her voice clear. "I promise quiet days, evenings of stories, and respect that never fades." William followed. "I promise patience, truth, and a heart that listens." Their kiss was gentle, not for show, but for memory. The crowd murmured, some smiling, some wiping tears. Alice's expression softened, her children clapping. As the guests drifted away, Eleanor rested her head on William's shoulder. "We did it," she whispered. "We did," he said, his voice warm. The house, once a silent shell, began to hum with possibility. But could this happiness endure? Years passed, soft as the turning of seasons. Eleanor and William built a life of small, sacred routines. Coffee each morning on the porch, poetry and books each night by the fire. They planted herbs, wrote letters to Boston friends, and took slow walks into the hills, their fingers sometimes brushing like a quiet vow. Alice and her children became regulars, their visits filling the house with laughter. The children called it Grandma's home, no longer a distant estate. Eleanor took up dancing again, her steps slow but joyful, twirling to old tunes in the parlor. William recited poetry, his journal filling with notes. He laughed today, bright as a girl, her eyes full of spring. One summer evening, as their grandchildren chased fireflies in the cottonwood grove, Eleanor sat with Alice on the porch. William emerged, carrying 2 mugs. "Mint or lavender?" he asked, grinning. "Surprise me," Eleanor said, her smile warm. Alice shook her head, chuckling. "Of all the things, Mother, marrying a stranger?" "He wasn't a stranger," Eleanor said softly. "He was just waiting to arrive." As the sun dipped, painting the sky in gold, the family gathered on the porch. The house, once echoing with absence, now sang with stories, footsteps, and the creak of rocking chairs. Eleanor squeezed William's hand, her heart full. "We did all right, didn't we?" He looked at her, his eyes soft. "More than all right, Mrs. Prescott." The cottonwood swayed, their whispers no longer of loss, but of music, a life rebuilt, moment by moment, in the warm Wyoming breeze. Loved Eleanor and William's story? Like and subscribe for more heartwarming tales of love and courage.